Welcome to the StoryWorks Reading Series, a podcast for readers, writers, and readers curious about writers. I'm your host, Alita Winternheimer. This month, the StoryWorks Reading Series brings you Recreation by author, editor, and illustrator Robert James Russell. After he reads his short story, we have a conversation about working with unnamed characters, the challenges of epistolary storytelling, the solace of nature, and things we can't decode. If you enjoy the StoryWorks Reading Series, make sure to leave us a rating and review wherever you find podcasts. You can find links to Robert James Russell at storyworkspodcast.com. Now sit back and enjoy this month's short story, Recreation by Robert James Russell.
Dear Camper, I can see by the way he flits his fingers out to touch the spears of sunlight piercing the boughs of paper birch and eastern white pine, and how the brackish blue water of Lake Huron seems to sparkle in the pink sunrise light as he wades out into it, that he's now perceiving things on a whole other spectrum. This is what I know. We hiked through Negwegon State Park, where he used to go with his family when he was young. We ate fried Spam sandwiches with American cheese and too much ketchup. We set up our tent just at the edge of the pebbled beach and spent hours searching for Petoskey stones, but found none. I suggested we make love out in the open while we were admiring the swooshing panorama of stars, but he said no. He just wanted to lie together for a while. I know that he's out on bail, and we got permission to head north, that he reports to Detroit's 36th District Court for sentencing in 5 days. I know that his lawyer told us anything other than the worst would be a good day. I know I have to stop myself from breaking down all the time. I pinch my thigh or the side of my neck near my ear and turn away from him often. I see this man sitting by the fire in a small foldable chair, poking his fingers at the pebbles and announcing when he finds green or red ones. He's a husk. He hasn't shaved in days, and it used to be a thing I'd get on him about, how it irritated my face when we kissed, but I don't say anything now. I'm hyper aware of local advertisements with their from around here actors selling cars and fruit and furniture that pop up on the radio when he's listening to Tigers games and how they might provoke another breakdown. Even just the sound of a child's voice can do it. I don't know how we survived this, and the only person I can tell that to is my mother, who reassures with Bible verses and tells me he's a good man who did something bad, that he deserves our prayers and sympathy and strength. I don't know that I have this much strength. And if I'm being honest, the hardest part about the whole thing was him lying about everything that night. We did everything together, and even though we had our own friends, we were always clear about what we were doing and when and why. That night, he was skulking, talking in odd coded language about seeing friends from work in the city at a new bar. He was in a hurry to leave. I thought what anyone would, I guess. Something was off, but he wasn't going to cheat, I told myself, not him. I had a glass of wine. I watched something on TV. I went to bed. The next morning, we had breakfast together. He told me a story about what drinks he had, what drinks his coworkers had, details I never asked for, and too many of them at once. Then he flipped the news on, and it unraveled. Before long, he was prone on the kitchen floor, weeping hysterically. My heart raced. I felt dizzy. I couldn't even fathom putting together the truth on my own. That he'd been secretly planning for weeks to go into Detroit at night to a row of rotting houses where people were shooting up. That he had some notion out of completely fucking nowhere, pardon my language, that he should go to these houses and burn them down. They were already blighted with overgrown lawns and plywood boards nailed in over the doors and windows. If junkies couldn't get to the houses, they couldn't shoot up, and maybe, he guessed, he could save a life that way. He took out cash from an ATM and bought 3 plastic 5-gallon gas cans and black jeans and a black hoodie and rope, although he could never fully explain what the rope was for. He parked 3 blocks away and saw not a single soul on his way to the houses. He told me later that he wasn't even nervous when he was placing the gas cans and rags in the front rooms. There was no rush of adrenaline, no second guessing. He said it was the only time in his life when his head was sincerely clear and there was nothing but his actions, nothing but moving forward. Back at home, he changed in the garage and dumped the old clothes, anything that could tie him to his actions, into a plastic bag he layered on the bottom of our garbage bin. He went upstairs, took a shower and brushed his teeth and crawled into bed with me. He kissed my neck and fell asleep. When he said it all out loud, my knees buckled. I went outside and fell to the grass and wept. Later, I told him we had to tell someone, that if there was to be mercy and forgiveness, it would have to start with us doing the right thing. We contacted a lawyer who contacted the police, and he turned himself in 2 days later. It's hard not to be awed by this place, isn't it, camper? The way the light hits everything, the quiet. It's like you really see the majesty of the world in a place like this, all we take for granted in our lives. I'm looking now at a pile of copper leaves and some stones rounded out by the power of the waves. It's incredible how all these little pockets of universes just exist right on top of one another. We don't even matter, do we? He wasn't, he assured me, a pyromaniac. The way he figured it was, even if all 3 houses didn't burn, or somehow the Detroit Fire Department actually showed up on time, at least he'd be making a statement of some kind. So he didn't stick around to watch the houses go up. And he didn't know anything about the boy that was in one of them sleeping off a bender. The hate mail and protests started up soon after. He was in jail awaiting trial, and it was just me at home, but the news people came in swarms, stationed out in the street. I thought about going out there and saying something, but I was guilty by association. There was no way they would listen to me, and I don't blame them at all. This is not going to end well. I have these sort of waking visions almost every day, different versions of reality that play out. In one, I wait for him, and maybe he gets out one day, but he and I are never the same, can never overcome this. I put my life on hold for something he's done because that's what's expected, right? In another, I waited out for a while until I decide I need to live my life, that I can't be in his harrowing shadow any longer. In another, he tells me this himself, and he's made peace with it, assures me he understands. I move to Anaheim, where my sister is, and find a job teaching out there. I go back to my maiden name so no one can make a connection. I eventually meet someone else, but he and I still write letters back and forth, and everyone is happy. I like that last one best. Don't you? Who wouldn't? It's funny. My mother had an estranged brother when I was growing up. She never told me what caused the rift, but she barely talked about him until I turned 14 and she found Jesus again. Her pastor had told her to write letters to him to ask for forgiveness, to tell him that he was loved. She wrote a letter a week like clockwork. Most of them got sent back to us, returned to sender, and yet she kept on writing in the hopes one would get through. I hated the whole process, and we fought about it all the time. I didn't understand how a letter could smooth things over, how it could be enough. Now I'm writing letters all the time, to myself, to the boy's family. I don't understand it, but there's a kind of tenderness to bear it all on the paper like this. I've even written a stack of letters to my husband ahead of time. It all feels silly until it doesn't. I haven't told my mother I'm writing letters. I don't want to give her any sort of satisfaction, which I know seems petty, but it is what it is, and that's the sort of relationship we have. Anyway, now I'm here at a picnic table writing this letter, watching the sun burn out in the sky, and my husband waist high in the water studying the slight curve of the horizon. I can't see his face, but I'm sure he's crying. When I finish this, I'll fold it up and put it in an envelope and hide it somewhere in the campsite under a large rock or in the folds of a birch tree, or maybe I'll just weigh it down with a lake stone right on top of the picnic table itself. I wrote a couple of others and hid them in places around my house, one in the attic and one outside underneath the patio furniture and another in our tool shed tacked to the wall. Camper, maybe you'll never find this letter, or maybe you will and know about my husband from the news and already have your mind made up. I guess I don't care. Him doing it is not being contested, and I'm not here to ask for anything, let alone forgiveness. I guess I'm recounting what I know so I can keep it all straight as it comes crushing down on top of me. So here's what I know, camper. For a moment, up here in vacation land, breathing in brilliant, clean air and trying to understand how many shades of green exist in the world and holding hands as the fire crackles behind us, everything seems possible. We walk amongst the undergrowth along worn earth trails. We look up at the treetops towering above and marvel. Birds communicate in song around us. The waves offer messages only we can decode. We come across a little pond and see our still reflection staring back. Here, he never leaves the house that night, and this is nothing more than an intermission, some recreational weekend to center ourselves. Here, there is no fire, there is no boy. Here, I get a say. But then I see him again. He looks like a smudge. The world, the water, and the light seem to be repelled by him. I know tomorrow we'll wake early with creamy morning sun. I know we'll pack up the tent and our things and head south towards home. I doubt we'll talk the whole way. Kindly, Camper.
That was Robert James Russell reading Recreation. Robert is the author of the novellas Messiah with Dock Street Press and Sea of Trees with Winter Goose Publishing, and the chapbook Don't Ask Me to Spell It Out with Whiskey Paper Press. He is a founding editor of the literary journals Midwestern Gothic and Cheap Pop. His work has appeared in print and online in Gulf Coast, New South, and Passages North, among others. He has taught writing courses and workshops around the country, including at the Iowa Writers House, New Harmony Writers Workshop, and the University of Michigan. You can find his illustrations and writing at robertjamesrussell.com or on Twitter and Instagram at Rob Hollywood. Well, welcome so much to Storyworks Reading Series. Thank you for sharing Recreation with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you tell us about your history as a writer, which includes creating and editing 2 literary journals? So you've got a lot of experience on both sides of the desk.
Yeah. I have wanted to be a writer in some form since I was 10 or 11. We had in my elementary school, I really hope, I don't have any children, but I really hope this is still a thing that exists. We had a chance to make our own storybooks in elementary school. They had like these big blank template books and you can make it whatever. And I have always been a drawer. My father is a designer of office furniture, an industrial designer. So I've been doodling my whole life, and art was always a path I thought I was going to go down. And then I had a chance to do a book with art and words. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic. And I was actually just talking about this today with some friends, but I recently repurchased Where the Sidewalk Ends by Shel Silverstein, which was a seminal book for me. And I don't think I realized how much seeing someone draw and also their words along with it really affected me as I got older until recently. But in some form, I've wanted to be a writer since that age, and then many, many digressions and, the question mark years of college that where I wasn't doing any writing, but still wanted to call myself a writer kind of thing. I did not get involved in literary journal writing community in college, kind of because I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what I was missing out on. It wasn't until much later that Jeff Fowler and I decided that we wanted to start this literary journal. And it was around the same time that I started really publishing my own work for the first time. I think in my 20s, especially my first half of my 20s, I really didn't understand. I didn't understand what a writer was. I assumed if you wrote a book, people would come to you, which I know seems incredibly stupid, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And I wrote this 300,000 word novel in college that is unreadable by anyone, myself included, that will never see the light of day ever again, and things like that. And then I just took a lot of time off from writing, which I think was one of the best things for my writing, where I was exploring the world and traveling. I'm born and raised in the Midwest, but I moved out to Los Angeles and went to grad school in England, and just needed to kind of get around and see some stuff. And when I was in England, I was studying for a master's degree. I was studying regionalist literature, and I started really falling back in love with the Midwest, because sometimes you need that distance to see what's been there all along, right? And I started realizing at the time that I feel like there had never really been this huge national push for Midwest literature as a whole. Obviously, fantastic Midwest writers, but as far as literary journals and things like that. So I had this idea that I was like, oh, what if there's a literature journal? And I talked to Jeff Fowler, who was a friend of mine from college, about it, and a writer as well. And he was like, I love that idea. And we started, playing with the idea a little more. And then Midwestern Gothic was born. And I was publishing some poetry, a lot of poetry actually at the time, and some stuff like that. And I still was trying to figure out who I was as a writer, what my voice was going to be. And to me, I thought getting into editing, I've always been very proud of my editing skills. I don't say that I'm not that confident about many things in my life, but I can say that. And I was like, okay, well, this is going to help me, one, kind of see what else is out there and see how these things are done, and kind of have this be my introduction to the landscape that I'm just very, very unfamiliar with. And it was a trial by fire. It was fantastic. It was harrowing at times, especially when we first started doing it. We went to a year after we started AWP. So in 2012, we went to our first AWP in 2012, a year after we started Midwestern Gothic. And it blew my mind, right? Like it does most people who go to this big writing conference. And mostly I was like, well, who are we? we're no one, right? Oh my gosh. And yes, Midwestern Gothic, we announced this year that Midwestern Gothic is going to be permanently retiring, which is sad, but the right move.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a bummer, but I'm very happy with what we did. We put out, for our run, which was 10 years, we put out mostly quarterly print issues, which I don't even understand how we did that in hindsight. And then for the last 2 years, we just did biannual issues, which was also a lot of work. Very, very proud of everything it did. It connected me to these lifelong friends I have now, introduced me to editors. It helped me become a better writer. I talk to a lot of young writers when I do workshops, or even, panels and, things like that. And the advice I almost uniformly give is like, get a job at a magazine, do something at a magazine. It makes you a better writer. Like reading all of this work, seeing how people are doing things in different and new ways. It is the best experience I've ever had as a writer, quite frankly. Yeah. And then, sorry.
Oh, that's great. You have touched on so many wonderful things. And I know we talked before we started recording about you coming back for the roundtable. So I definitely want to get you talking about voice and editing and so much. Yes, I can't wait for that. But you're speaking into the voice specifically, which was one of the things I wanted to talk about in this story. So first, do you consider your voice to be particularly Midwestern? What are the qualities of a Midwestern literature?
It's a good question. No, I think, I think about, I've lived in a lot of Midwestern places. I currently live in Nebraska, which I've now living here, I've had some people question whether this is the Midwest. And I'm like, yes, absolutely. If Nebraska is not the Midwest, I don't know what the Midwest is. Michigan is where I'm born and raised. I lived in Indiana for a little bit. I think tenacity is a big part of being in the Midwest. Perseverance of just existing, which I know sounds super dramatic. I think I currently live in a state, Nebraska, that has no real tourism to speak of. It's a beautiful state. People don't give Nebraska a chance. I really love it here. And I think that perseverance extends to the harsh winters in a lot of places, absolutely, but also just recognizing that we're not really we're not in the national conversation in any capacity, and yet life goes on, and we're still here, and all that kind of stuff. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Crane watchers love Nebraska. I actually passed through Nebraska on my way to Colorado one year and just happened to hit the crane migration in Kearney. Yeah. It was amazing. Yes.
Yeah. I saw it this year for my birthday in April, and it was the top 5 moment of my life. I mean, there's nothing that can even describe it really in full, as you know. It's incredible.
It is. Yeah, it is. I just saw William Kent Kruger being interviewed for Talking Volumes, the Minnesota Public Radio show, which I think goes out nationally on NPR. But he and Carrie Miller were talking about the Midwestern voice, and what you're saying definitely agrees with their conversation as well, that the landscape is such a huge part of this, and the tenacity, the perseverance, the survival piece of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you identify as a Midwestern author, or having traveled broadly and lived other places, has your voice developed in broader or different directions?
I think it's definitely broadened in other directions. I think this sounds silly, I think, a little bit, but I think you can't not, when you travel a lot and see the world and live in other places, it's hard not to just expand everything about yourself. I do consider myself to be a Midwesterner. I think that by traveling and seeing what else is out there in the world, I have just become even more of a Midwesterner in certain parts. I mean, it's, no region is perfect. And obviously having a whole region the size of the Midwest is complex anyway, because North Dakota down to Missouri, I mean, there's very, very different landscapes and peoples in these places, right? It's a fascinating concept, this regionalism, but yeah, I do. I think you had mentioned the land. I think, I feel like there's always a discourse out there about people who say the land is a character, and then the other side who says, no, it's not. I firmly fall into the former. I think that's a lot to do with my Midwest upbringing. I mean, I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're about 30-ish miles from Lake Michigan. Obviously there's worse places in Michigan when it comes to winter, but winter lasted for us mostly like November through April, like that long. The skies are just gray. And when it snows, right? So like, it really is like, it's hard not to be born from this landscape, because you're constantly thinking about it. And here in Nebraska, this is my first time living in the plains. It's so flat, and there's not a lot of trees. A good example is this week. Today it was 70 degrees. Tomorrow's going to be 74, and then it's going to be 30 the rest of the week. It's hard not to have conversations about the weather in this place, because it's constantly shifting and changing, and it's always on my mind, which I kind of love as a writer. But I think non-Midwesterners, like I lived in LA for a year. It was like 71 degrees every single day. No,
right.
You talk about the smog, sure, but nobody's really talking about the weather, because it's static all year. It's the same, never changing, right?
Right. Yeah, I so relate to what you're saying as a native Minnesotan, and I think as a writer, as you're saying, we can't take the weather for granted, and so the landscape and my character's experience of their environment is always on the page.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, your landscape really comes through in this story. my favorite moments, I think, are when our narrator is being observant and is describing that landscape. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the opening.
Sure.
Dear Camper, what inspired you to write an epistolary?
Kind of the non-fun answer is I have never written an epistolary story before. I've always wanted to. It's difficult to do. I think it's a form that seems simple and it's very complex to do well. Not suggesting I did well. I hope I did well. But it's complex to come up with it. And I think every time I'd ever come up with an idea in that direction, it just, narratively, it made sense to have a narrator or something like that. And it didn't kind of work out that way. I had come up with this idea. The plot of this had been something that had popped into my head randomly when I was living in Southeast Michigan a long time ago. And I struggled with, I think, figuring out what this was going to become. And I focused, every time I thought I was going to start the story, I focused so much on, I don't know, it was very grave. And to a point that there was nothing to get out of it at that point. And then I was questioning why I was even writing it, and I would put it away and I'd come back like, oh, what if I started this? And every time I came up with a point of view shift or approach to how I was going to do this, it ended up in a place that I didn't like. And then this is part of a collection that of mine that I've drafted and I'm slowly working on. And when I was thinking about this and I was thinking about the tone of the collection and what it was going to be, it just popped into my head to try this and to remove, there are details of the narrative, what happens here, but by the nature of this being an epistolary short story, like it removes a lot of stuff that I think was weighing me down in the past that I thought worked really, really well and lent itself really nicely to what I was trying to do here. So the camper part, I think, again, the non-fun answer is I think it made sense. I was really thinking about who this character was that was reading it. All the initial iterations of what I was doing it was going to be from the husband's point of view and more details about that night in Detroit. And then I didn't like how that was going. So I scrapped all that. And I was like, oh, what if it was somebody dealing with the ramifications of what someone else has done? Those closest to us and the burdens we sort of take on ourselves from the people that we love, what that does to us. Fascinating topic and conversation. When your lives are so enmeshed with someone else's, their journey becomes your journey for better or for worse, right? And I had my initial thoughts doing this. I thought there was going to be names with stuff, but then I was like, as I was developing the character, I was like, okay, it makes sense to me that this character is just writing a bunch of notes to people. The note at her house that she mentions in her tool shed might say, "Dear neighbor." This one, she's at a state park in northern Michigan. So to me, it would make sense, since she's camping, that she's writing it to whoever is going to be here next. And I liked that. And as I was developing that, I was like, it makes sense that she also it refers to her husband by name or herself by name either. So.
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. And I love that you're telling us about the evolution of this character in this process. It was really interesting being addressed throughout the story as the camper, as a reader, the experience of reading this, because it feels like with epistolary fiction, we often have a writer and an addressee. And so we have two characters and we're sort of the fly on the wall or peering over someone's shoulder to read it. And here I felt like I was the camper, like I was being directly addressed by this writer. So was that just part of this process of choosing to keep people unnamed and anonymous, or were you consciously addressing the reader and trying to draw them into the story?
Both, I think. I think in the realism of the story, realism in quotes here, of the story of what I'm producing here, I think that, again, weighing my options of what happens, I think calling us, the reader, camper, as if we are picking up this note and see ourselves, immediately puts us in the action, right? In a way that I was not able to do in the way I'm sort of getting across, right? I also think in this particular instance, I think in a not naming the characters actually grounds this more in reality. The second that she refers to her husband as Kevin, now it's a character named Kevin, right? Mm-hmm. That we don't know and we've never met and we never will meet because it's fictional. And in this specific instance, I thought that actually took away from what I was trying to do, that this is just an unnamed character. And then there was the sort of, I guess, the sort of legal ramifications too. I was thinking that, okay, well, this character is smart enough that she's probably not going to be writing her name in a letter talking about some heinous thing that her husband did, or her husband's name, even if they recognize the story that's being told. There needs to be some distance between what, this desire, this need to get it out on the paper, but also to be able to distance herself from it a little bit, which I also thought worked nicely too, because, part of the story is her working out what's going to happen to her. I think by not naming her husband and not naming herself in the story as a character, it sort of further removes herself from the situation and what potential futures might be on the horizon for her and her husband too. I think, it's like anything. The second you start naming things and, it's like good gossip. If you gossip, I'm not going to tell you who this person is, but here's what I learned. The second you name them, it becomes real, maybe in a gross way that changes the whole nature of it. Right. Mm-hmm. And I thought that just continued to make sense for what she was trying to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. It does make sense. And as writers, there's so many choices we need to be aware of, or maybe we aren't always aware and we're subconsciously thinking about these things, like what would naming do to the reader's experience of this story. Now, as an epistolary, it's of course a first person narrative. Did you find you had to develop this character, the wife, in order to write this story? Or was it just a process of letting the voice come through and letting that voice create the narrative as it's speaking?
I think in this instance, honestly, I think a little bit of the latter. I think I started writing, as you know, first person's tough. And it's funny to me because, I used to teach literature classes and everybody wants to write in first person.
Yeah.
Until they realize that, you can't have 14 characters that all sound exactly the same. And you actually have to think about voice and timbre and all this kind of stuff. And it becomes complicated. Be like, okay, third person it is. And obviously I'm none of us are immune to this. First person is difficult to pull off well. If you're not going to give us a full set of thoughts, but you're in first person, there needs to be a good reason why we're not getting a full set of thoughts too. I always enjoy challenging myself to try something different as well too. But this one is layered. It's a letter. I was trying to write this as a literal letter of somebody who is not a writer, but somebody going through it. So I'm trying to strike a balance of it being literary because I'm writing it, but not unbelievable to the point that this person wouldn't be writing it or saying it or thinking it out loud. Right. And I think when I started thinking about it, I was like, I just have to write this. I can't overthink it. I think there are absolutely hallmarks of my writing tics and my voice as a writer in this. Absolutely. But I really tried to keep it simple. I think her voice comes through less from the actual words on the page and more about what she's seeing, more about as we learn from her, repeating the actions of her mother, and will never tell her mother that she's repeating the actions of her mother. I think there's more characterization in this instance that comes not from the actual voice on the page, but more from what we're seeing and how we're seeing it through her, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It makes perfect sense. Voice is critical to this piece, and it was so interesting reading it. I was giving it my internal voice as a reader. And, the narrator comes across as female and I'm female. So as a female voice. And then you started reading it in your voice. And until you got to the line about taking back her maiden name, I was like, oh, this actually works as either,
Yeah.
And also being an epistolary, experiencing it that way on the page as a reader. It's a found text. And so the only voice it has is the voice I give it. But then as you were reading it, you were adding inflection and emphasis in places. And so I was having the experience of the narrator's emotional state being delivered through the words. It was a very interesting experience, meeting the story both ways, first as a reader and then as a listener.
Mm-hmm.
As a writer, do you hope that readers add inflection, add emphasis? I mean, their own, obviously, we can't control how that happens. But if you could make a wish for how a reader takes in this story, what would it be like?
It's funny. I think one of the things I had to learn, and I continue to have a hard time accepting, is control of inflection. I love italicizing words. I love it. It in some ways, I almost like to push back against the system and say, no, this is where I want you to inflect right here. There's a reason for it. I'm hearing it in my head. I recognize that's kind of a faux pas. I think that you can get away with it here and there. I often, when I'm editing my work, the first thing I'll do is go through and unitalicize just about every 99% of what I've italicized in it, and realizing like, okay, that's not the journey of the writer necessarily. I like theater. I like performing. I like plays. I was in musicals and plays all growing up. I like performance. It's a fascinating, it could be its whole conversation about the life that stories take once they're read out loud versus on the page, and how different they become. Right. Mm-hmm. I think I don't have a way that I want it to be read. I think that's sort of the fun of this specific story. And I'm thinking in my head of, which is not helpful to a podcast because you can't see what I'm thinking, but I'm thinking of a bunch of different stories of mine that are really, really specific and more narratively specific on the page, where they're not designed to force you to go in a bunch of directions. Like they're really honed in on this one idea. This is really the opposite. This is let the floodgates open. We don't know anything about this person. We don't even have a voice of who this person is. I love that. I think that's magical. I kind of love that everybody who might look at this would read it in a slightly different way, given how sort of open it is. So I have a couple instances where I did italicize still, and I kept them in here, but I did remove a lot because I also realized this is also a letter and it wouldn't make sense to do that. Although in my defense, when I do hand write, I do underline stuff to italicize still. So
I do too. I do too. I'm definitely a handwriter for first drafts. I get it.
Oh no, that I don't do actually.
Oh really?
Yeah, I can't. I just generally when I'm taking notes, I underline. You're one of those fantastic people that can hand write, and it seems like such a magical process. And every time I've ever started that, I throw the paper away and I'm like, screw it, I got to get back to the page. So can't do it.
Yeah. Well, now I'm faced with typing up probably 1,000 handwritten pages because I didn't type as I went. I just didn't want to face the typing. And now I'm nearing the end of this first manuscript. And I'm like, oh, damn it. I have much typing to do. It's depressing.
I have a friend of mine who was just telling me recently, it's a very similar story. Oh, my first draft's almost done. It's X number, hundreds of pages. I'm like, cool. It was like, yeah, next step is I got to type it up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, which I recognize there's no right way to do it. I also say this because my handwriting is the worst chicken scratch that you've ever seen in your entire life. And I cannot read most of it most of the time. So
yeah.
Yay processes. They're all different.
They are. Yes. Yeah. I actually have a friend who offered to do some typing for me. And I'm like, you wouldn't understand it. I mean, it's legible, but I insert and I have asterisks and it's crazy.
Absolutely.
But back to your story.
Sure.
So does the husband know why he did what he did? the narrator doesn't understand it, the reader can't understand it, which is great because the story is not about understanding it. But as I was reading, I wondered, does the husband know, or is he as lost as the rest of us?
That's a really good question. I don't think in my head at any point of designing this, I ever had a note as to why, maybe early on, but I mentioned in there that just wanting to make a difference or something like that. I very much consider myself to be a Stoic, and I try to practice Stoicism. I love it. It really saved me in my 20s. And, one of the biggest components of Stoicism is you cannot change other people, only your reaction to things around you. Obviously, emotions are fine. I'm an emotional person, very emotional person, a writer. I think in some ways, thinking about this, first time I thought about this, I think in some ways there's some reaction to this being a Stoic story in some way, that we're not ever questioning what happened. We know it happens. We're questioning how we deal with terrible situations. And I think the question we ask ourselves when tragedies arise in our lives or trauma happens, which is not a bad thing, obviously, is why did this happen? And often I think, and I say this from personal experience, that the question historically is never, well, what now? Right. And I think for me, that's something that's consistently shifted in my life, focusing on it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean I don't think about the past and learn from it, but at some point the past has happened. How do I take what happened and make sure that I'm living my best life, that I'm taking care of my mental health, all that kind of stuff. So I don't know that I have an answer for it. And I also don't know that I want to pretend to give one, because I think it adds a little more mystery to this. And I say explicitly in here, like, he wanted to make a difference, to save some people. And I guess you could argue there's some sort of toxic positivity, definitely this state of privilege, like not even considering. Now, I do not obviously state the race of the person in this, but I assume this man to be white. And I assume that there's a lot of privilege involved with this, that, oh yeah, naturally, I'm going to go burn down 3 houses in Detroit. What could go wrong? Right. That's a very privileged viewpoint that I think to me made sense in the story. I kind of like leaving it at that and letting that be it, because like you said, it's really less about what happened. We know what happened. This is what happened. It's inevitable. 5 days. He's reporting to his sentence. So what now? And what does she do now? How does she make right with this? Which is a terrible non-answer, I realize, so I apologize. But
no, it's a great answer. I mean, I think the question for me really came from the writer's mindset of, is that something you had to know for yourself as you were developing the story to even get to the point of saying, that's not what this is about. Now I'm writing the wife's point of view. And it's about forward looking. And, my take on the husband was that he must have some sort of mental illness or imbalance, whether it's lifelong or temporary or recently developed. And it was interesting, the passage where the wife is imagining different futures, and one is waiting for him and not waiting, and then him freeing her to go meet somebody else. Is that how she processes how to be her best self, or is she clinging to, all of those options very much involve him, and the best one, the one she likes best, has him giving her permission, actually.
Sure. Yeah.
To leave him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, that to me, I think it is clinging to hope in some way, right? Because again, she's not guilty. And in fact, she's the one in the story that recommends that he reach out to a lawyer and turn himself in. And yet she's going to be guilty by association. And yet, to the point where in one of these scenarios, she has to change her name back to her maiden name just to avoid the Google, right? And get a job and avoid all this kind of stuff. I think that's the one. I think I put that in there, and she's clinging to that. because who wouldn't want the best case scenario? But deep down, I don't think that would ever be a case that would happen where everything wraps up nice and neat. And I think that's a big thing that I kept coming back to when I was writing this, is like, nothing is nice and neat ever, right? Like,
right.
Not ever, rarely are things nice and neat, and now we have an instance where this terrible things happen and she's trying to imagine scenarios, and absolutely that would be a fantastic thing to happen, but realistically, it's not going to be that easy. And she's trying to just understand what's waiting for her on the other end, and what her reaction to these things are going to be.
So one of the things that really struck me about this story is the sadness of it all. And, I didn't find myself sad for the fires or even the boy. I was sad for our narrator, for the camper, and how she's in this beautiful environment trying to experience her last couple of days with her husband before he goes to prison. And he is so absent. He is just so distant from her. And there are the consequences, what he did. But what really strikes me is the way what he did is upending her life. Did you have an emotional impact in mind when you wrote this? Was there a tone you were striving for?
Well, abject sadness.
It worked.
Yeah. It's funny. I actually really, I know there can be, I know that there can be superstitions with talking about works that aren't finished and stuff like that. But the collection of stories that I'm working on is called Something Seems Off, is the name of the collection. And it's a series of stories where everything seems to be picturesque in some way. And then there's something that upends that in some way. Here we have this gorgeous setting, this fall day, the copper leaves on the ground, right? And yet. Not all the stories that I'm thinking about in this collection when I was thinking about this are as terribly sad as this one, I think. But to me, this, again, I wanted to be real to what would possibly happen. I think as I was developing it, thinking, oh, this is going to be a letter. How would somebody, at what point would someone actually be moved to write something like this, and how would they end it? And I, quite frankly, it ends very sad that they're probably not going to talk, that they have this trip up there together, and yet they're not spending time together. Now, on the flip side of that, she seems to be incredibly aware of the beauty around her, questioning, the microcosm of their existence, and how everything just kind of sort of exists no matter what's happening to them. I would argue in some ways that that's some positive thinking in some way, right? My personal beliefs, I have made known very publicly. I like feeling miniaturized by nature. It's not that I like feeling like I don't exist or shouldn't exist, but I like knowing that the planet is going to exist without me, right? I like knowing that I am a small blip on the radar. And I think part of that colors in her experiences that are happening here. There is the sadness that she's barely making a connection with him. They do cuddle. They're holding hands in a scene, but otherwise he's off by himself, probably crying all the time, as she mentions. There is part of her, though, that's making a connection to this place, which I think is some solace in some way, which is why, again, I think I might say that's some happiness. But I was trying to be real to the story. I think if I had wrapped it up, well, and that was that, and I lived, obviously that's an extreme what I'm trying to say, and very silly, but it made sense to me that she's writing this letter. She doesn't really understand what's prompting her to write these letters, and she sort of just trails off at the end, right? And she's hoping that by unburdening herself in this beautiful place, maybe whoever reads this letter, if anybody reads it, just, the weight of unburdening, right? Like, it's a powerful, powerful thing. She says in here, she's not asking for forgiveness. It's done. It happened. She's not contesting that. But, I think there is a power in saying things out loud. There's a power in recording things that have happened. I think that's sort of what she's tapping into here. And that's the angle I was kind of going with, that it happens to be sad, but it wasn't necessarily by design at first. It just sort of ended up that way.
Yeah, the solace of nature really comes through in those passages when she's describing what she's seeing. But then there's that line about we don't really matter at all. And toward the end, there's a line about messages in the waves that can't be decoded. And so even that solace is bittersweet. It's constantly being juxtaposed to the reality of her situation. In some ways, the whole story seems about things we can't decode, things we're trying to understand or make sense of. And it's just not possible in any way.
And I still think that this makes me sound like an incredible pessimist, and I'm really not. But I really think that there's a beauty in just centering yourself and just existing, not needing an answer for everything. And I'm not even going to get on my high horse talking about the internet and phones and all that stuff. I'm old enough to remember when I didn't have that stuff, but just humans in general, right? Like needing to go, be busy, be distracted. There is a power in just letting go and existing. There's a power in the stillness, right? And I think that's a big part of who I am. So that sort of finds its way into a lot of my work, whether I intend it to or not. So,
Yeah. And that makes sense that she's drawn into this process of letter writing, of putting it down, because that is where she finds stillness. When the mind is going crazy, just slowing down, picking up a pencil or a pen can be enough to center you, Yeah. Where did the idea for the mother and that backstory with her finding Jesus and writing to the estranged brother come from? It's such a great section of the story that just adds more dimensionality to our narrator. It really serves her well and serves the reader well.
Thank you for saying that. From my family life, which all good stuff is.
Yes.
I am not ragging on writing letters. I think the trigger for me when talking about stuff, and it works perfect here, was in anybody anywhere thinking that not doing the heavy lifting of making amends, thinking that doing something by writing a letter, for example, is the same as making amends, or understanding where the problem occurred and why it occurred and trying to understand that and cut it off and fix it, which is not unique to my family. I mean, also, I think that's a very American thing too, like gloss it over and forget it. And people in my family have a history of writing letters, which sounds great in theory, but it's writing letters instead of, I think, doing the heavy lifting of really trying to fix, understand, and fix, and think, and understand some more, and so forth and so forth. And I've never actually included it in anything, but it made sense here. And like you said, I was thinking about it. I was like, that's a great little bit of backstory that I, in 2 lines, right, or 3 lines, gives us a great idea of who this person is, where she's come from, and if we know that she's writing letters, it's bad, right? Like last resort, she's gotten to this point of writing letters. It's the same. If anybody gets a handwritten letter from me, it is it's last resort. So,
right. I love the contrast. She has disdain for what her mother was doing. That whole process seemed pointless to her as growing up, being a witness to her mother's letter writing, and yet here this compulsion to do the same thing, but then also not. It's anonymous, and she's not asking for anything to come of it. It's just this process she's going to, and life is so often like that,
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. She signs her letter with kindly camper. So you're giving the reader and the writer the same moniker. What does that mean to you? Why did you choose to call both reader and writer camper?
Well, yeah, and I'll be a little meta here, because part of this whole process, the whole thing is you and I going back and forth with some edits, and your edits were fantastic. When I initially wrote this, there was no one. It just ended with kindly, which I liked. I think I don't know what my reasoning was for that. I was holding on to it. I think I was going to the extreme of like, there's no name. There can't be a name here. Camper works because the letter is both to herself, I think, and also to anyone who's willing to read it, who's having some sort of existential crisis in some way. At this moment, she's just a camper. She mentions here they go back to reality soon. Even with everything happening right now, she's still just a camper in this place, like whoever is reading it next. And I like that symmetry, that she's both writing to herself and to whoever might find this next, if anybody ever does. And I think it works really, really well with what I was trying to do. And again, credit to your fantastic edits. I think having this works far better than having a blank, which I actually think is even bleaker, right? If there's a blank, it's like, I've given up. The letter's over. I'm done. I'm not even going to sign my name. I'm done. Here, you could maybe I'm trying here, I'm reaching, but maybe argue that there's a slight bit of optimism, that she's both writing to herself, that there's a sort of like, I know that I'm going to survive this. I am also the next person who's going to read this. Like, we will get beyond this. We will go by. And, to your earlier question, she's running through a scenario in her head, all these different scenarios, but she's alive in every one of these scenarios. Right. And I think that's an important thing she's gripping on here. She doesn't know what happens next, but she is going to be alive. She is going to be a camper again, maybe somewhere else. Right.
Right. Yeah. I actually love that. Your meta explanation there. I love that camper is this name we can take on temporarily when we are in the act of camping. But here it's also temporally a title that she gets to have now, and then the reader who discovers that letter will get to take on later. And I also agree with you that there is some optimism in it, that she can come back to this place or headspace of being in nature, being in beauty, being tranquil, finding peace, but at a different time, in a different set of circumstances, and come back to center. Yeah, I think that's great. It's the perfect end note for the piece.
Hey, fantastic.
Yeah. What challenges did you face writing this piece? You said you conceived of it when you were living in Michigan, so that must have been some time ago.
Yeah, I moved away from Michigan in 2016, so it's been a minute. And I've lived a lot of other places in the world, but Michigan's always been my home, and I've lived in Michigan in various places the longest. The challenge is, even if we're talking just the actual drafting of this version of it that we have, I'd say the challenge is what I mentioned earlier. It's this form is it's not necessary. It seems easy and it's not. And again, there was a lot of drafts of this where the original draft was way more details, drafts with names in it, drafts that went on and on and on and on, the detail, we edited some stuff out from when she's explaining the night, but then there was drafts where they're explaining what happened that night took 3 pages, right, in detail. And I was like, no, that's not the point of it. And I think it was harder to find a tone and a narrative through point for this than a regular story. I'm fortunate that I tend to be, I do a lot of internalizing when I come up with a story idea. I do some outlining, but I do a lot of internalizing, and I think and obsess and jot down notes here and there. And then at some point it reaches this, the meter in my head is full and I'm like, okay, time to write the story. That usually happens quicker than with this. And I think it took a lot more processing and thinking about what I was trying to do and how I was going to do it. And then obviously during the drafting stages, doing it right for her, this character, and what needed to happen with it. So I think that was more of a challenge. I think, as I mentioned, I've been thinking about this. Not inspired by actual thoughts I've had, to clarify for everyone watching. But if anybody's ever been to Detroit, I mean, Detroit is really famous for its blighted homes for lots of reasons. There's not really a lot of manpower in the city to deal with that. If you drive into Detroit on just about any highway, you see rows and rows and rows of burnt out homes. I think the idea just came out one day of like, randomly like, oh, how could that have oh my gosh, what if that was a story? But again, I think my initial thinkings of this were all wrong and sinister in a way that I wasn't really trying to go for. You could go in a very sinister, dark way that I really wasn't trying to do. Not that this is innocent, and not that this person is not a terrible person for what happens, but I think making it more about the wife, and having it be more of a conversation about those around us, how we overcome not our own sins, but the sins of those around us, how we come back from these things. Can we come back from these things? That conversation to me actually seemed far more interesting than just a basic, let's follow the guy into Detroit and see him burn down a house. That's not super interesting to me. Yeah.
Right. And she does seem to love her husband. I never doubted that she loved him or thought that they must have had a terrible marriage, because he did this thing, and just they're, spending time together this way and camping, which adds a nice layer of complexity to the piece. It's definitely more interesting what you did here, following the woman and the repercussions, the fallout that she's facing. And I like too that it's very much a story of her interior. It's not about getting the lawyer. It's not about the haters on the lawn. It's not about the media. You put her in this bubble out in nature to draw us into that experience, which is unusual and also highly effective. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think to that point, I think where they're at is sort of a great equalizer. They're removed from everyone. So what happens when it's just the two of them? We kind of see what happens throughout that. And I agree with you. I thought it was more interesting than seeing the minutia of the other stuff that happens. And I will take any chance I can get to write about nature in some way. So, hey.
Yes. Yeah. Do you consider yourself an environmental writer?
I would like to think so. I guess I associate that with more aggressive political, not in a negative way, but posturing, like we have to make change. But I think that there's a power in just writing about nature and having people experience it in some way. I think I had a I'm going to plug myself, sorry, but I had
please do.
a series of micro essays called We Know So Little that came out through Pigeonholes, which is a literary journal. And each essay, I think there was 15 of them total, and each one was about a specific animal or plant or being in nature, and sort of explaining the history when we do that. And I like education is the greatest gift that anybody can have about anything. We educate ourselves and become better people, become better neighbors, become better humans. We understand what's happening in the world. So I guess you could argue anybody who is painting a portrait of nature in some way is an environmental writer, because they're talking about something that someone might have never seen or understood or witnessed before, and kind of bathing in it even through an indirect way. There's definitely a lot more I could be doing, absolutely, as far as that goes. But I think I think this goes for any writing anywhere. If somebody reads your piece and has gained knowledge in some way, you've done your job as a writer, right?
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can even expand that in addition to gaining knowledge. If someone gains appreciation, if you bring your setting to life, as in this story, and the reader thinks, oh, I should go walk in a forest, or I should go camping, or I should go visit Lake Huron, or I should, then that is doing good for the world, for the earth. It's funny. I asked Jonathan Haidt, who was the last author on the StoryWorks reading series, if he considers himself an environmental writer, and he also hesitated. It's like it's a title of, I don't know if I'm worthy of that one.
I mean, that's really how I feel about it. I think that would be a very kind thing for someone to say about me that I don't know that I would deserve. So if I'm being generous, sure, but there's a lot of people doing more heavy lifting, I think, if we talk about environmental writing, in my mind, than what I am. But back to your point, I agree with you. I think if there's an appreciation taken from it, if somebody's understanding something they didn't know before, my We Know So Little series was really about taking a moment to just be awed by things that you don't understand. A blade of grass is a complex creature with a life cycle. Just be awed by these things that we take for granted every day. So if that can happen, if I can help with that, cool. If that's an environmental writing, I'll take it.
Yes, I think so. Fantastic. If I'm qualified to bestow the title, I will
Thank you.
hand it to you and Jonathan Haidt both, because you both write phenomenally well about the environment.
Thank you.
It's deserved. And I have a recommendation. Are you familiar with Barry Lopez?
Yes, but I've never read that book.
Yeah, last time I checked, which was many years ago, it was out of print, but this is, copyright 76 and 79.
Wow.
So definitely an environmental writer. I used to read his articles in Outside Magazine long time ago. I had a subscription to that, but this is just one of my favorite little volumes of environmental writing. And they're these mini pieces, but what you were describing about your micro essays reminds me of this collection of Lopez's. And actually, I'll do a little plug now. The next episode of StoryWorks Roundtable coming out, I read just a passage, like a page from one of his pieces in here, and then Catherine and I dissected it. So for everybody who loves environmental writing, check out your micro essays. Where can people find those? Do you link to them from your site?
Yeah. RobertJamesRussell.com has all that stuff. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah. Good. This has been such a great conversation about a really wonderful short story. I am honored to have you here.
Thank you.
StoryWorks Reading Series is open for submissions, and I want to see your short stories and personal essays. Then sit down and have a chat with you about your work and creative process. StoryWorks Reading Series is the podcast that gives voice to your stories and you. Submit today at storyworkspodcast.com.